and welcome, Luke. Thanks for being with me. It's really good to talk to you. We might get started. I'll start with a few questions, and as Anthony said, hope we can get some questions from everyone who's with us. I was going to say this morning, which it is for us, but wherever you are, please do feel free to send questions in. So, as Anthony mentioned, Luke has written a really interesting and worthwhile, and I actually think quite moving article for the philosopher on forgiveness. And I say moving because there are some stories in there of forgiveness that, well, well, they move me, and I think they're really rich sources for philosophical reflection, which is what Luke does. So very much recommend that everyone reads that when you can. Luke, Anthony mentioned you have noted um, the extent to which people are talking about forgiveness in philosophy, and that there's a lot out there, and that your task in some ways was to try to disentangle some of the confusions and make clear what's out there and what people are saying. But also, I mean, in the article, you note that in the history of Western philosophy, actually, there hasn't been much focus on forgiveness. So I guess I'm wondering why you think that was, why you think there was not much of a focus in the early history of Western philosophy, why you think that changed, and what brought you to the topic, what interested you about it.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So it is mysterious to me why there's not a long history of engagement with the question of interpersonal forgiveness in Western philosophy, given that the Western tradition is so heavily influenced by Christianity, and forgiveness is a central virtue in Christianity. And in particular, if you look at the Bible and look at New Testament claims about forgiveness, you see Jesus telling us to forgive one another. There's a lot written in the history of philosophy and in theology about God's forgiveness of humans for our wrongdoing. But there's not a really close focus on what it means for one human being to forgive another human being, on what I'm going to call interpersonal forgiveness. And I do think this is strange, because if we think about our lives now, our moral lives, all of us have been wronged. All of us have wronged others. And the question of whether we should or shouldn't forgive is often a live question for us. It's puzzling to me that philosophers were not really focused on this question. Philosophers were writing a lot about rights, about responsibilities, about duties, about happiness and well-being, and how we should structure a just society and so on, but not telling us whether we should forgive and what forgiveness amounts to. Now, as I have claimed in my book, the contemporary philosophy of forgiveness in the Western tradition really grows out of a series of papers in the 1960s and 70s, where philosophers started to interrogate this concept and examine more closely what it would mean to forgive. So when you're reading philosophers of forgiveness now, most of them are not closely engaged with the history of philosophy. This is not true across the board, but that is very strongly the trend. Now, why did philosophers start to care about forgiveness and focus on it? I think probably because there are some really tough trade-offs in relation to forgiveness, and in particular, the relationship between forgiveness and justice, whether in forgiving we are somehow potentially giving up on the pursuit of justice. There's a prima facie tension there. Lots of philosophers argue that when we examine it, we see they're totally compatible, but that's something that would have to be argued for. And if you think about contemporary movements focused on social justice and focused on victims' rights and so on, you can see why some people might be pushing back against the idea that forgiving is always the right response to wrongdoing. So you asked as well how I came to work on forgiveness. Before I was working on this topic, I was writing a lot about evil. So I was thinking about atrocities, extreme wrongdoing. And one of the questions that arises in that domain is whether it can ever be appropriate to forgive someone for committing an atrocity. So responses to wrongdoing include forgiveness. And that was my introduction to the topic. Now, I was raised as a Christian and left the church as a teenager, and I'm an atheist and have been since. But I'm fascinated by the kind of history of Christian influence in this topic. I engage with lots of philosophers who are Christians, who write about forgiveness. And so I guess I've got some kind of personal history. I want to give a secular account of forgiveness that makes sense to people, whether they're religious or not. And likewise in relation to evil. So I guess that's my personal entry into this topic.
Given the religious context of so much, especially early writing about forgiveness, and the fact that it was God's forgiveness, and as you mentioned, you're now thinking about forgiveness in secular terms. I'm wondering, is it a vastly different enterprise if you take the sort of religious background, the theological background out of the equation? How much does that change what it means to think about forgiveness? Does it maybe not change it that much at all? You said you're in dialogue with religious philosophers. Is there much common ground there, or once you sort of evacuate the theological elements, does it become a very different thing?
Yeah, so I think some some theists who believe that forgiveness is the right thing to do, uh, they see themselves as following a divine command. They think God has told us to forgive, and that's why we should forgive. Now, obviously, if you're an atheist, you think that's out of the picture. But there are plenty of theists who think, well, God has told us to forgive, but God has done that for good reasons. And there are things about forgiveness that make it a good thing that we ought to do. So there's plenty of common ground between secular philosophers and religious philosophers in examination of the reasons for and the for forgiving and the potential costs of forgiving. There is, I think, generally a more skepticism about forgiveness, or more wariness about forgiveness in a secular setting compared to in a religious setting. But it's worth noting that there are very strong non-religious traditions that really praise and encourage forgiveness as well. And the most obvious of those is the therapeutic tradition in psychology, right? So if you look at the way that a lot of psychologists talk, they'll tell you that you ought to forgive the people who've wronged you because that's the way to regain your own happiness. They're not grounding that story in any kind of divine command or view about what Jesus told us to do. They're telling a therapeutic story about the victim's own well-being and how the victim can live a happy life in future. So, I think there's a lot of common ground, some differences between religious and non-religious philosophers here, but a lot of common ground. And I think it's worth saying as well, it's not like all of the religious philosophers hold exactly the same view about forgiveness, about what it is and when we should do it. There are really interesting disagreements within the secular tradition and within the religious tradition.
Sure, sure. Well, I was going to ask, as a sort of preparing the ground, that maybe we could get a rough definition of forgiveness, but I actually wonder whether partly what you're doing in your book is leading to an appropriate definition of forgiveness. And so, I mean, feel free to, if you want to sketch out a starting definition, that's great. But I was going to ask, I mean, in the book, you lay out three intuitions that you say we have about forgiveness. And interestingly, what you say is that they can't all be true at the same time. They're not compatible. So there are tensions there. We have to choose perhaps some combination, or perhaps just one. You can tell us. But why don't we begin actually by just laying out those three intuitions, and why can't they be all true at the same time?
Okay, great. So I will try and give you a really quick sketch of a definition of forgiveness. So forgiving is a possible response to wrongdoing. It's something that you might do as a victim who has been wronged by another. And philosophers who are writing about this almost universally agree that forgiving is separate from excusing. So forgiving is something that happens when you still judge that that person wronged you and it was that person's fault. So potentially when you're wronged, you get angry, and then you might come to see in some circumstances, oh, that person was forced to do that, or they didn't really know what they were doing. And that might lead your anger to dissipate. And you say, it wasn't really that person's fault. So that's excusing. Excusing is one way to get over a wrong. Another thing that happens sometimes when we're hurt by other people is we initially judge that we've been wronged. We get really angry about it. And then we come to see that they actually did the right thing. They did not perform a wrong action. We were harmed, perhaps in some way, but they did the right thing. That also leads us to get rid of our anger. We say, oh, okay, I wasn't really wronged here. So philosophers call that justifying the action. And again, philosophers are going to say forgiving is separate from justifying. When you forgive someone who you believe has wronged you, you still think that they wronged you and you think there was no good excuse. And nonetheless, you move on from it, or you get over it, or you no longer hold it against the wrongdoer. So they're kind of common paraphrases or ways we have of describing what forgiveness is. But there is huge disagreement when we get down into the fine-grained details of what forgiveness is. And philosophers have put forward a range of really different views about the kind of getting over it or the kind of moving on that is present in forgiveness. So as you pointed out in my book, Real Forgiveness, I try and give a diagnosis of why there's so much philosophical disagreement on this topic. And I think there are three key intuitions that people have about forgiveness, which are incompatible with each other, where we can't endorse all of these three claims at the same time. So the first one is that forgiveness is permissible whenever it's possible. So roughly speaking, the idea is if it's possible for a victim to forgive the wrongdoer, then there is a morally good act of forgiveness available to that victim. Right. Now, that's something that you might believe if you think forgiving's something that we ought to do whenever we're wronged, or if you think every act of forgiveness is good, something like that. So forgiveness is permissible whenever it's possible. The second intuition is forgiving is available to all victims of wrongdoing. That's something you might believe, for example, if you think all of us have been commanded to forgive those who've wronged us. Or you might hold that view, forgiving is always available to victims, if you think forgiveness is a valuable path to happiness and every victim has a right to happiness. I say, okay, so we've got to make sure forgiving is available to everyone. And the third of those intuitions is that forgiving produces peace. It leads to the removal of conflict between the victim and the perpetrator. Right, so this is a very common view about forgiveness. If you ask people why forgiveness is good, why they're seeking to forgive someone, or why they're seeking to be forgiven, frequently they'll talk about wanting to get away from that anger and conflict and into a harmonious relationship. So they're the three intuitions. Forgiving is permissible whenever it's possible.
Could I just jump in, Luke, on that second one, that forgiveness is available for any victim? What would it mean for forgiveness not to be available? What would be an example of that?
Yeah, great question. So sometimes you might think forgiveness, some philosophers think forgiveness is not available to some victims because contentiously, they think that forgiving is essentially a communicative act that happens between two people that is similar in some ways to promising. Now, arguably, you can't promise that you'll do something to someone if you haven't communicated with them. So if that person's dead, you've lost the opportunity to promise. I think apologizing is like this too. I think apologizing is essentially communicative, right? So some philosophers think forgiving is in that category. Forgiving is an essentially communicative act. So they might think some victims cannot forgive the perpetrator because they can't communicate with the perpetrator. The perpetrator
Is dead, for
is
example.
dead, right? You've lost the opportunity. So that's one reason why you might think forgiving is not available to every victim. But another pretty common thought here, which I personally reject, is the thought that forgiveness is available only when the perpetrator is repentant and apologetic. So there are philosophers who've defended the view that you can go around and pretend that you're forgiving unrepentant perpetrators, but that's not really forgiving them. That's something else. You're condoning the wrong, or you're mistakenly, you're not genuinely forgiving. So these philosophers think that forgiving is essentially a response to repentance. Now that if you hold that view, then you're going to say not every victim has forgiveness available to them as an option, because some of those victims were wronged by unrepentant wrongdoers and they might be waiting for them to repent. They might want to forgive, but if you held that restrictive view about forgiveness being essentially and always a response to repentance, you'd have to say some victims are in a position where forgiveness is not an option.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so we have the three intuitions. So why can't we just hold on to all of them? Could you give an example
Yeah,
where they
so
might clash?
here's my argument, and I want to preface this by saying lots of philosophers disagree with me on this point. So this is an argument that I'm trying to make to win over some supporters. If you interview some other philosophers, they'll disagree with me. So here I think is the incompatibility. If we think that forgiving is available to every victim, then we think that sometimes victims will have forgiven unrepentant, dangerous, repeat offenders, right?
Hmm,
And this is something that victims sometimes say that they've done, right? It's a kind of unconditional forgiveness that includes forgiving people who they know have not changed.
yeah.
So that's step one. There is forgiveness of unrepentant repeat offenders. Step two is to say, whenever forgiveness is available, there's a morally good act of forgiveness available. Forgiveness is permissible whenever it's possible. So that would suggest that there are morally good acts of forgiving dangerous, unrepentant offenders,
Hmm,
right? Okay, and here we add in the third intuition, and here's where the problem arises. If you think that forgiveness necessarily includes the removal of conflict between victim and perpetrator, and you're also committed to the view that there are morally good acts of forgiving dangerous, unrepentant repeat offenders, then you're in a position where you're saying, okay, it's got to be morally good to remove yourself from conflict with dangerous repeat offenders. And my
yeah.
argument is sometimes that is not morally the right thing to do. There are some situations where victims are morally required to remain in conflict with dangerous repeat offenders. For example, to try and ensure that they're punished, or to try and ensure that other members of the community are warned about the wrongdoing. So these moral reasons, I think, sometimes are really strong. Victims have got a reason to remain in conflict with a dangerous repeat offender instead of forgiving them. And that's why I think if you try
Hmm,
and hold all those three intuitions at the same time,
yeah.
you end up in this very unstable position where you're saying, it's morally good for me to forgive and remove myself from conflict with this person. But by doing that, I seem to be facilitating reoffense and putting other members of the community at risk. So
Well,
that's my argument for saying you
yeah,
can't have all three at once.
yes, I see. So, well, let's look at what may or may not be a potential counterexample to this, and that would be you wrote about I'll have to look for her name, June Steenkamp, who was
Yes,
the mother of the woman killed by Oscar Pistorius. Um,
that's right.
and uh, she claimed to have forgiven Oscar Pistorius, while at the same time she did everything in her power to prosecute, to have him locked away, to have him not released. Um, and so I guess if that claim of hers to have forgiven him is right, then is that an example of those three? So in other words, you can in fact say that you have forgiveness where you are still in conflict. I mean, there's certainly conflicts between June and Oscar Pistorius.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really illuminating example of what happens when people are kind of struggling with those three intuitions and they've got to decide to abandon one of them, which this is the position that I think all of us are in, really. We
Yes.
can't endorse all of those three intuitions, so we've got to decide which one we'll let go. And you're right, in this situation, June Steenkamp, who is a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, who believes she has been commanded to forgive everyone who wrongs her, June Steenkamp says she has forgiven Oscar Pistorius. Right. And she says, when she's talking to journalists about this, she said, I've forgiven him. I have to. That's my religion. But she's also very clear that she wants to see justice done. So these were interviews that were done with June Steenkamp during Oscar's trial, when Pistorius was on trial, and June was determined that he be punished. She described herself as already having forgiven him. And I think you're right. June here clearly is still very much in conflict with Oscar Pistorius. So how does this work as a conception of forgiveness? I think what June Steenkamp has done is she has abandoned the claim that forgiveness brings peace and removes conflict between victim and perpetrator. So this is actually a pretty common view of forgiveness. You resolve that tension by saying, I can forgive you. And that means something like, I don't hate you and I'm not angry with you anymore. But having forgiven you, I'm still going to keep fighting with you and make sure that justice is done, make sure that you're locked up against your will, and so on. So that's a way to try and resolve the tension. It's not the only way to resolve the tension. And there are other philosophers and, other people in ordinary life who choose a different intuition to sacrifice, and they end up with quite a different definition of forgiveness.
Does a parent who finds they do need to discipline a child, are they in a state of non-forgiveness when they're doing that until it's done on this picture?
Yeah, that's a great challenge. So my view is that the intuition we ought to get rid of is the idea that forgiving is permissible whenever it's possible. I think sometimes it's morally wrong to forgive. I want to hold on to the intuition that forgiving produces peace and absence of conflict between victim and perpetrator. And these cases of parents forgiving children are really interesting because parents clearly love their children, and sometimes they have to hold the wrong against the child in the sense of, saying there have to be consequences for this. You have to learn your lesson. And I think in situations like that, if the child accepts the punishment and thinks, yep, okay, I think forgiveness can be in place because they've both moved on past the wrong.
Yes, I see.
Even though, if the punishment is accepted and they're not still fighting about it. But if the child is saying, this is ridiculous, why am I, losing my pocket money? Why am I losing my television screen time? Right? This is really unfair. And the parent has to enforce that punishment on them. I would say this is a case where the parent has not yet forgiven the child for the wrong, because they are in that kind of, they're still battling over that wrong. I think it's very possible that a parent in that situation is no longer angry, and clearly still loves the child and doesn't think that the wrongdoing is something that dramatically disrupts their relationship. But I do think there's a sense in which they're still in conflict over the wrong, so forgiveness is not yet in place.
So June Steenkamp could on this picture could love Oscar Pistorius.
This is a really tough question, and particularly for Christians who believe that we ought to love everyone. That's a moral view about love that is not universally endorsed. There are lots of people in the world who think this particular wrongdoer, this extreme wrongdoer, ought to be hated, not loved. But if you think love is always an appropriate attitude to hold towards other people, including extreme wrongdoers, what are you going to say about forgiveness? Now, some Christians say that forgiveness is the expression of that love. But there is a danger here that if you think forgiving involves removing yourself from conflict with the wrongdoer, you think maybe loving means letting them go about their business without interfering. It seems morally dangerous to do that with lots of repeat offenders.
I guess I'm trying to come up with an alternative way of describing June Steenkamp's attitude. You've already come somewhat towards doing that, because you've said maybe she doesn't hate him, which you might not want to go as far as to say, well, she could possibly love him while trying to have him locked up and hated by everyone. And, but is there another way we can characterize her attitude? If it's not if what she's doing is not forgiveness, kind of, what is it?
Yeah, good. So I think June Steenkamp thinks that she is forgiving Oscar,
Like,
and there are going to be plenty of people who accept her definition of forgiveness and go along with that. Some of the critics will say she is not actually forgiven Oscar. She's under religious pressure to say that she has and to think of herself as a forgiver, but in fact, she is fighting a justified battle with Oscar to ensure that justice is done out of respect for her daughter's life. And
yeah,
a lot of philosophers who write about this will say, look, it would be a mistake for June to forgive Oscar Pistorius when he is not only unrepentant, he hasn't even admitted that he did anything wrong. So they
right.
think, they would say, June, you're not actually forgiving him, and good on you, right? He does not deserve to be forgiven in this situation. And there is an important moral message that needs to be sent to the community that perpetrators, even when they're famous, right, cannot get away with crimes like this. And you ought to continue to hold that against Oscar and ensure that he's punished for his wrongdoing.
Mm, mm.
So some philosophers say it's not forgiveness, June, and good on you.
Yes, okay. Well, let's move to another example because I think it again fits into our conversation about these three intuitions, and this one's in the article. Um, Maybe the other one is too. Yes, the other one is too. Um, Abdirashid Farah Abdi. This is a case from Australia who a terrible wrong was done to him. A woman chasing him in her car. I think she'd done physical injury to him. Um, he immediately forgave her, or we can discuss whether he did or not. Um, but one thing that he also did was uh, raise the possibility that there might be some mitigating factors. In other words, there was an element of excusing happening in there. Now, you already mentioned in your first definition of forgiveness that forgiveness is different from excusing. Um, Obviously the two can come together in some way, can't they? Because even if if you've done a terrible wrong to me, and I'm very badly hurt by that, and you are the one who did it, but there are a whole lot of reasons that made it very hard for you not to do it. Well, I might accept all of those reasons. Is there still room for forgiveness though? I mean, a wrong has been done, or a terrible thing has been done and you're the one who did it, is there not room for still forgiveness in that situation? And that's a similar situation to Abdi's.
Yeah, so you're right. In this situation, Abdi, the victim who was pursued by Alabaster in her car, she was trying to kill him, according to Abdi, and she was threatening and saying that she was doing that. So this is a pretty extreme example of wrongdoing. Abdi describes himself as having forgiven her repeatedly. Right? He uses the language of forgiveness.
Mm,
He interestingly also calls for leniency in the legal sanctions against this wrongdoer. So he thinks part of his forgiveness is saying, go easy on her, on Alabaster, the perpetrator. But this is a situation where at other points, Abdi, the victim, describes himself as, or describes the wrongdoer as someone who wasn't really in control of what she was doing. It was the drugs that made her do it. What we're dealing with here is drugs and mental illness. And all of this is the language of mitigation or excuse. So what's going on in a case like this? Um, as I've pointed out, philosophers typically say excusing is separate from
mm,
forgiving, because when you excuse, you say it wasn't really your fault. Whereas when you forgive, you say, it was your fault, and yet I'm going to move on from this. Now, what you're pointing to here, I think, is really common. It's that often our initial reaction when we're hurt by someone else is to jump to the conclusion that this was a terrible wrong and they had no reason to do it. And this is kind of malicious and nasty. And then later we might come to revise that the extremity of that judgment downwards. We might come to see, okay, this was not quite as bad as I thought, and maybe there were mitigating factors. Maybe this person's life was incredibly difficult. Maybe there was a lack of rational control in what they were doing because maybe they were on drugs at the time. Right, so there's a range of considerations that are typically taken to be mitigating. And if we think mitigation is partial excuse, then we're in this tricky position where it looks maybe we're disagreeing with the philosophers. We say you can forgive a wrong and excuse it at the same time. Now, my response to this would be to say, look, there are situations where we partially mitigate a wrong, but we still think there is some kind of wrongdoing there for which the perpetrator is responsible. And that is a target for forgiveness. So we might kind of lower our judgment through mitigation and then forgive the rest, forgive the remainder. And this is what I'm tempted to say is going on in the case of Abdi and Alabaster. Another possibility here is Abdi is, talking through things that are frequently said by victims in a situation like this. And, Abdi's not a philosopher who's being, criticized by other philosophers and told to be consistent in everything that he says on this. So another possible interpretation of what's going on is that those two things that Abdi is saying, it wasn't really her fault. It was the drugs. It was mental illness. And I forgive you. Maybe those two things really are in tension. And if we think more slowly and carefully about it, we might have to decide whether this is a case in which Abdi is going to excuse the person who was chasing him in the car, or whether Abdi would, mitigate the wrong and forgive the remainder.
Sure. I suppose some of this comes down to what you think about guilt and how it comes to a person. I can think of a situation where I might be driving along doing absolutely nothing wrong in my car, and a small child runs out in front of me, and there's nothing I can do about it. I kill that child. It seems to make sense to me that I might beg forgiveness of the mother of that child. Now, is that a category error? Or, I mean, let's leave aside, obviously I can handle that situation however I want on an emotional level, but what's going on there? Is that, am I right in seeking forgiveness there?
Yeah, these are really complicated cases, and this kind of example has been discussed by philosophers a lot since the work of Bernard Williams on this in the 1970s.
Right.
So Williams focuses on cases where people accidentally inflict extreme harm on others, and asks whether someone who does that should feel guilty, should they feel ashamed, should they be apologetic. And Williams says they should feel something he calls agent regret about what they've done. They should feel terrible about having done it. And the way they should feel about it is very different to the way that a mere bystander should feel about what's happened.
Right.
But this is very morally complicated territory. I think you're right that a lot of people who accidentally inflict harm on others apologize, and some of them might even ask for forgiveness. But think about what would happen if you in that situation say, I'm so sorry for what I've done. And the surviving family members say, thank you so much for admitting guilt here. This is going to make the trial a whole lot easier, because you taking responsibility for this really shows that, it was your fault, and we'll be pushing for conviction. Now, in a situation like that, you might say, whoa, when I said I'm sorry, I didn't mean I am fully morally responsible for this and I ought to be punished for having done it. Right? I was trying to express a different thought. So I think this is a very messy territory. So Glenn Pettigrove, a philosopher who is visiting us at the University of Sydney at the moment, is arguing for the view that forgiveness can be appropriate in situations like that, just as apologizing can be appropriate. I'm worried in situations like that it might be, in fact, more accurate to say, well, it wasn't that person's fault. There was actually nothing to forgive, but a terrible harm was done. And there are ways you can kind of express regret for that without saying, this was my fault, and, putting yourself in the line for punishment.
Yeah. Look, thank you, Luke. We should have a look at some questions. While I'm having a quick look, though, just finally, I don't want to give away the end of the story. I think you already have, but I think you favor maintaining that last intuition about the peaceful end state as being an important, in fact, a necessary component of forgiveness. Just while I'm looking at questions, does that mean you have to reject both of the others, or only one of them?
Only one of them. So my favorite view is when you've forgiven someone, you are now in a stable state of peace in relation to that wrong between the two of you, right? So forgiveness is a way of ending conflict. I think there are all sorts of ways to forgive, and I don't think forgiving is just one kind of action. I think forgiving is getting into that peaceful end state. But I don't reject both of the other intuitions. I think forgiving is always available to victims of wrongdoing. But the one I reject is the idea that whenever it's possible to forgive, it's permissible to forgive. So I think sometimes it's morally wrong to forgive. That means I'm in disagreement with a lot of Christians who advocate unconditional forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I'm in disagreement with a lot of therapists who say that whenever you've been wronged, you should forgive. And that's a permissible thing to do to regain your own happiness. I think it's a kind of tragic burden that falls on some victims that they morally ought to keep fighting against the perpetrator to protect themselves and others. And I think given that that continued fighting is incompatible with forgiveness, those victims are in a state where they morally should not forgive.
Well, that's really helpful, and as you say, you can see why there might be some protest about that claim. But um, yeah, that's great. The first question I'll take here is from Anne Hutchinson. I'll just read it. I'm wondering about how to forgive someone or someones who have passed away. We mentioned this earlier. There is no longer the opportunity to discuss face to face, as it were. How does one forgive and move on when the wrongdoer is no longer living? This can apply in family relationships, as in genocides. And Anne is involved with genocide victims in Rwanda. Where does that thought, you mentioned that some would say that you can't forgive someone who's dead. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think you can forgive the dead. There are philosophers who disagree. Charles Griswold is an interesting example of a philosopher who thinks that once that person is dead, you can move on in various ways emotionally, but you've lost the opportunity to forgive them. So one thing worth saying here is in forgiving, I think you get over your resentment and anger, and you can certainly feel angry towards someone who's passed away, and it's possible to lose that anger. So that part of forgiving is certainly available in response to someone who's wronged you and has since passed away. I think it's easier to forgive the dead in this second respect. So part of my definition of forgiveness is that when you've forgiven, you're no longer in conflict with the wrongdoer over the wrong. And it's easier to remain out of conflict with someone who's dead. Right.
That's
So
true.
another really telling factor here is someone who has passed away is no longer a threat as a potential reoffender. And that might change the kind of rational calculation as to whether it is dangerous or safe to forgive. So I think forgiving the dead is possible. There are some considerations in favor of doing it. There are some interesting arguments against doing it as well, particularly if we're thinking about atrocities. So some victims of atrocities say, never forgive. And one of the things we ought to do in commemorating is eternally protest this wrong. Never say, that was okay and I've let it go. So there are really interesting and difficult discussions between Holocaust survivors, for example, in relation to
Yes.
whether it's ever appropriate to forgive the Nazis. People who are interested in this, I thoroughly recommend the documentary film Forgiving Dr. Mengele, focused on the Holocaust survivor Eva Kor, who disagrees strongly with some of her fellow survivors as to whether forgiving dead, unrepentant Nazis is morally okay. Now, part of the question was also, how do you do it? How do you forgive someone who's dead? I haven't got particular guidance on that. And I think that different people make that journey in quite different ways. Some people forgive by, trying to sympathize with the perpetrator. Others do it by trying to focus on the benefits that will come to them as a victim, the benefits in terms of happiness. Other people get to that endpoint by focusing on other moral projects, saying this is not really a fruitful kind of anger anymore. So I think there are just lots of different paths there, and kind of whatever works for you. Not helpful
Sure.
guidance, but I just think human experience on this is really varied.
Sure, sure. I'm going to move to a question from Chris because it raises something that's occurred to me. He couches it in the we start with the religious thought that we really started our conversation with. Luke has said that he was surprised how few people have written about forgiveness in Western philosophy. Given that Christianity popularized the concept of free will in order to justify evil in a perfectly created world and justify why God is sending people to hell, St. Augustine. Doesn't it make perfect sense that forgiveness in the West is coming from a place of weakness, i.e., the forgiver is doing it for their own reasons, they are really forgiving God, and has little to do with the other person? And you have raised in either the article or the book something Oprah Winfrey says, forgiveness you do for yourself, you don't do for the other person. I wonder about that. I mean, if it seems to me that doesn't there have to be some kind of other focused element to forgiveness? If it's purely for ourselves, isn't it just an instrumental act that the end we're seeking is nothing to do with the other person whatsoever, but rather a peaceful end state in me, not between us? What do you think?
Yeah, so there are philosophers who have defined forgiveness such that it is always motivated by concern for the perpetrator. That's a really restrictive view of forgiveness, but you can see why you might end up in that position. If you think forgiving is essentially and always generous, right, then the thought that I'm forgiving to secure my own future happiness doesn't really work, right?
Right.
Because, you can't be generous to yourself. So this is one reason why there are philosophers who've got, a tightly restricted definition of forgiveness. I think that is too restrictive. I think that forgiving for the sake of your own happiness is really common. I think there's massive amounts of psychological literature and therapeutic self-help discussion making that claim. So I think we ought to accept that sometimes people do that. It's a separate question as to whether you think it's morally good for them to do that. So there, I again am going to side with Oprah to some degree, where I think that can be a morally defensible reason to forgive someone. If there aren't significant moral costs, then your own happiness is something that's valuable. That can be
Mm,
something that's worth securing. Now, the biblical claims about this are really interesting. I'm not a biblical scholar. I've relied on other people. I've obviously read the sections of the New Testament in which there are claims made about forgiveness. And it seems to me that there are just different claims being made at different points. So at some points in the New Testament, the recommendation to forgive is couched in terms of the benefits that then will flow to you as the forgiver. Right? So at
mm,
some points, it's you should forgive the people who've wronged you because then God will forgive you. You'll get a reward. This is the language of prudence and self-interest. And there are people who think that's not the right spirit of forgiveness, and that's maybe morally objectionable. There are other points in the New Testament where the recommendation to forgive is not couched in those kind of reward-based terms, and instead the idea is God forgives us, and we should be like God in this respect, and we should forgive those who've wronged us.
mm.
Right, so that's a more kind of imitate God's nature to some degree by forgiving rather than forgive to get a reward. So within Christianity, I think there's scope for a lot of disagreement about this. Obviously, for me, coming from a secular perspective, I don't think there's any kind of reward in an afterlife for forgiving. But I do think that forgiveness makes the lives of victims better in a lot of cases. So I'm
Mm.
kind of sympathetic with the view that sometimes, at least, that's a good reason to forgive.
And if that's the case, then according to your conclusions about which of those intuitions you face, there is it conceivable there might be a situation where it would be better for the victim and their sort of well-being and happiness to forgive, but at the same time is morally wrong for that victim to forgive. So it's morally right for them to remain in a state of unhealing or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
And
I
that's
think that's
difficult.
right.
That's a
I think
difficult
that
thing to say, right?
this is I think is the tragic situation. Some victims would be happier if they could just let it go and move on, but there's a morally really important fight for justice, and for protection of other members of the community. And they ought to stay in that fight, even though it gives them a harder life.
Yeah.
And this, I think, I'm describing this as a tragic situation. Again, if you look at Forgiving Dr. Mengele, that documentary, and you see some of the Holocaust survivors explaining why they think they should remain angry and never forgive, you get a very clear sense of that this is burdensome to them, this
Right.
burden of anger that they are choosing to carry throughout their lives. And their life might be easier if they gave it up, but they think morally they ought to maintain the rage.
Yeah. I might put two questions together here, and this may or may not take us to the end, but well, one's a comment really from Catherine Shearer. Not a question, but it seems that the philosophy, nature, and practice of forgiveness is highly relevant to truth and reconciliation processes. That's a comment, but sort of linked is Alice Tamimi. We live in a fractious time when it seems, to me at least, that impulses towards forgiveness are waning, at least in areas like politics and social media. Firstly, do you think my intuition here is empirically warranted? And second, if it is warranted, what can or should we do to cultivate more forgiving attitudes? On the first comment, in Victoria here, in the state of Victoria, we currently have what's called the Yuruk Commission, which is about our First Peoples and the terrible harms that were done to them. And there are similarities to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So at least here in Victoria and in Australia more widely, these are very live questions about truth, reconciliation, and forgiveness is, I guess, right in there as well. I'll invite you to respond to that how you will.
Yeah, so there's a philosopher called Lucy Allays who's written fantastic work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in connection with forgiveness. And this is, I think, not a straightforward story. So that is a social institution that was set up specifically not to produce punishment, but to produce reconciliation and healing and forgiveness. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu was involved in the design of this. And, he had an explicitly Christian focus, trying to encourage forgiveness. And there are cases discussed by Lucy Allays in which you've got what to many people looks like morally heroic forgiveness of unrepentant perpetrators by surviving family members, whose fathers, whose husbands have been killed by the police under the apartheid regime in South Africa. And Lucy Allays certainly admires this kind of unconditional forgiveness. But I think it's worth pointing out there were critics of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission who felt that what ought to be pursued in this context was justice, not forgiveness. And they thought they were being inappropriately pressured to forgive, moreover, in a public setting. So I think there's a fascinating tension here. It's not obvious to me that always the right response is forgiveness. Now, are we moving into less forgiving times? I think this is fascinating. I think we probably are. And I think there are social political movements which are currently trying to defend and, if you like, cultivate anger, righteous anger in response to injustice and wrongdoing. And that does seem to be, to me, that seems to be in tension with forgiveness. And there is a huge danger, as the person who asked that question is aware, a huge danger of endless cycles of revenge and ratcheting up the retribution that can lead to a horribly dysfunctional society and inescapable conflict. One of the powerful things about forgiveness is it offers us a way to escape that kind of cycle of revenge. But the tough practical question for people who are politically engaged in these spaces is whether, in forgiving, they would be condoning injustice and allowing it to continue, and whether they think what's morally best in the long term is to have a short-term fight over this, and it might be a fight in which a lot of anger is expressed, which will hopefully produce a more just outcome. So I think this story is very complicated. I think we are in less forgiving times. Personally, I think the world would be a better place if there was more forgiveness in it. And I say that as a philosopher who thinks sometimes it's morally wrong to forgive.
Mm.
So I think there is this terrible tendency in human nature to be excessively resentful and excessively retributive, even though I think sometimes it's right to be resentful and retributive.
Mm. I mean, we've started just at the end now. We can't develop this, but we have actually started, it seems to me, moving a little away from interpersonal forgiveness, the forgiveness of one individual of another. And once we start talking about truth and reconciliation commissions, and particularly ones where some of the wrongs are 100 years ago or more, and the wrongs are against peoples rather than individual people, although they're against individuals as well. Yeah, I guess there are all sorts of interesting questions about would we call it communal forgiveness? I'm not suggesting you should solve that one right now in our final 2 minutes, but perhaps that, and just finally, I mean, are there any sort of practical upshots that you can think of from some of your work as far as well, what Alice was really asking, I think, how can we cultivate? And that word cultivate is you may not, it may be beyond your remit, I'm not sure, but how do we cultivate forgiveness?
Yeah, so I think group forgiveness is a really tough question. There are philosophers who think there's no such thing because forgiveness is essentially a personal thing. It involves emotions. Groups don't have emotions. Members of the
Mm,
group can, right? So there's obviously a hugely important category of kind of group wrongdoing, group apology, group reconciliation. Tough question about whether we should also talk about group forgiveness. Now, how should we cultivate forgiveness in our lives? One option, this is the June Steenkamp option, is to try and be as forgiving as possible. Forgive in all cases where people have wronged you. So I think that's a mistake. I don't think that the virtue of forgiveness consists in always forgiving everyone. I'm actually really wary of the idea that there is a virtue of forgiveness. I think
okay.
instead we ought to try and respond well to having been wronged. And frequently that will involve forgiving the person who's wronged
Yeah.
us. But I think sometimes responding well to having been wronged requires you to remain in conflict with that person and maybe utilize your anger to produce a just outcome.
Mm,
So this is, I think, a more complex virtue, sometimes expressed in forgiveness, sometimes expressed in a refusal to forgive and a willingness to keep fighting. Now, I say all this knowing that we live in a world where there's too much conflict, and we would be better off if people were more willing to forgive. I'm just trying to defend the view that sometimes I think
mm.
forgiving is the wrong response.